When I was an undergrad, I spent 4 years of my life competing in national speech and debate. I'm not opening with this because I'm proud of the fact, but the good Lord does require honesty of us. Professor Schreiner provided the option for her students to turn in an alternative final project, not necessarily a formal paper and not necessarily in written text format. And since I took this class for the fun of it in the first place, I feel no compunction in presenting this. Welcome to my TED Talk. The purpose of this particular approach to research is, rather than to exegete a passage of Revelation, to use a question about the nature or significance of a passage to inspire a focused rhetorical investigation. All quotations and visual aids will appear on the screen with the appropriate parenthetical documentation, and a full bibliography will show at the end of the video. My research concerns the woman of the apocalypse, a common term for the figure described in Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 through 2. The verses read as follows, according to the NIV translation I copy-pasted from BibleGateway.com. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. This unnamed woman of the apocalypse is a striking visual in a book designed to be full of striking visuals. The book goes on to describe her giving birth, being chased by a dragon, and growing wings. While she's clearly loaded with symbolism, in true Patmos style, John, the author, never clarifies precisely what meaning she's meant to convey. My research is not about that. If you want to find people arguing about what she symbolizes, just Google it. I'll wait. The fact is, there are solid arguments for multiple meanings, and some really buck-wild arguments for the weirder ones. Rather than bothering with which one is right, my research tracks the different ways she has been interpreted by the church in different time periods and locations. The thing about vaguely symbolic stuff is they can provide convenient blank canvases for whatever meaning we seek or expect to find. Throughout church history, the woman of the apocalypse has been a favorite canvas, upon which the church has projected its values and interests, consciously or not. She can unintentionally become a model for the church's intent. However, because this often happens in response to subtle culture shifts instead of being due to clear theological creed, it's not always clear to see in written records. Where it can be found is in the art produced within those cultural milieus. By examining the art of Christians and pagan contemporaries, we can begin to draw conclusions about how the woman of the apocalypse has been interpreted, why, and what effects that might have had and continue to have. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to be analyzing how the woman of the apocalypse was understood and venerated in 4 periods of Christian history. First, how was a woman understood in John's time? Second, how was a woman understood by medieval Christianity? Third, how was a woman understood during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation? And fourth, how has a woman been understood in colonized Mexico? So, first, John's time. Generally, analysis of the woman breaks down into 3 categories. She represents the nation of Israel, the church, or the Virgin Mary. Each of these has solid textual arguments for it, but the reality is John likely didn't have a single intended meaning. What seems much more likely is that he had an end effect he was going for, and wholesale ripped off popular contemporary visual tropes to get the point across. John's description of her appearing with sun, moon, and stars are incredibly common visuals from classical depictions of female deities, especially if we identify those 12 stars crowning her as symbolic of the zodiac. Listen to the description Apuleius gives of Isis in his 2nd century text, The Golden Ass. Her robe was of fine silk shimmering in diverse colors, and sometimes, which sore troubled my spirit, dark and obscure, whereas here and there the stars peeked out, and in the middle of them was placed the moon, which shone like a flame of fire. In his essay, Astral Motifs in Revelation 12, Timothy Hegedus argues the point of Apuleius' description of Isis was to show her to be a heavenly ruler, Regina Caeli, who rules over the stars and fate. It's not unlikely that the portrayal of the woman in Revelation 12 has a similar purpose. And Hegedus wasn't fishing for that kind of association either, because Isis was far from the only figure represented this way in ancient art. Just look at this statue of the Ephesian Artemis wearing the zodiac as a necklace. Or this relief of Selene of Argos with 12 stars and the zodiac around her. Or this mural of Isis from excavations at Al Salamuni in Egypt, surrounded by the zodiac. Or even this unidentified figure from a mosaic in the Beth Elpha synagogue excavations in Israel. Giving a lady figure some stars to show her cosmic divinity was less a coded language of mystery cults and more like the first century version of political cartoonists slapping Greek robes, a blindfold, and some scales onto a lady to show us that she's justice. It's a visual shorthand. Hegedus goes on to explain, the presence of the zodiac on these representations had the effect of emphasizing the cosmic, universal aspect of that particular deity, highlighting his or her role as cosmocrator, lord of the heavens, who controls the progression of time and events. From such parallels, it's clear that ancient readers of Revelation 12 would have readily understood the circle of stars surrounding the woman's head in cosmological terms. There's another aspect to John's use of the woman, however, and that's a mythological bit. In John's time, all Roman citizens would have been familiar with the Greek myth of Apollo's mother, Leto, fleeing from the dragon Python during her pregnancy, only for her newborn son to leap from the womb and slay the dragon. In his book, From Patmos to the Barrio, David Sanchez explains how this Greek myth was used at the apex of Roman attempts to reorder the post-Republic era after the assassination of Julius Caesar. Rome appropriated the earlier dragon slayer myth to claim a genealogical relationship between the new emperor and the god Apollo. Now, there is a ton of material and discussion about Revelation's appropriation of this combat myth, as it's broadly called. Without going too deeply into the minutiae of the theory, though, for our purposes, it seems clear that the image and narrative we find in Revelation are neither unique to the text or coincidental in their associations. Instead, we get a broader visual of John borrowing well-known archetypes and tropes from the common, if pagan, culture in order to construct meaning that would be accessible to his readers. Alex Felder's dissertation, Birthing the Apocalypse, says it best. The images described in John's Apocalypse are limited by the constraints of language and imagination, and so he relies heavily on images already available to his readers and hearers through memory and experience. This means that John's Apocalypse is ambiguous in its attempts to convey otherworldly visions and ideas in terms of that which is known. Literary images lend themselves naturally to a variety of interpretations. Revelation could present satiristic code, but the images also had to make sense within a Roman context. Here's the bottom line. If John had wanted to make the woman in the Apocalypse clearly the Virgin Mary or the Church or something else, he could have done so easily and with much less ambiguity. So, what was the woman of the Apocalypse to the first century reader? I would argue she was never designed to be a one-to-one code for an existing figure or structure. Instead, because her entire appearance and narrative are built out of appropriated and recontextualized empirical archetypes, I would suggest her appearance is a model for how the promised kingdom of God will be a correction of the imperfect kingdoms of earth. Second, medieval Christianity. As we pass into the late 4th and 5th centuries, those obvious connotations lose their cultural relevance, so theologians began the work of recontextualizing the woman of the Apocalypse. This is where we start to get those three major analyses I mentioned earlier. At this point, though, readings are pretty open-ended. Quod vult Deus, a contemporary of Augustine, wrote, "The woman of the Apocalypse represents the Virgin Mary, who chastely gave birth to our chaste head, and is therefore a symbol of the Church." He wasn't alone in that opinion. Most of his contemporaries were of the same mind. Why did I choose him specifically to quote? Mostly so I could show off that I could pronounce this name, Quod vult Deus. Once we start getting into the 13th and 14th centuries, however, Laurie Jones Bergamini began to recognize a trend in the art of illuminated apocalyptic manuscripts, which she discusses in her dissertation From Icon to Narrative. While the official commentaries of the text continue to use the Augustinian model of multivalent symbolism, the art of the woman was beginning to look distinctly Marian. About 2/3 of the manuscript commentaries tell us that she's the church. The rest, that she is the church except at verse 5, where she is the Virgin Mary, but the Anglo-Norman apocalypses illustrate the woman as Mary. This disparity between commentary and illustration suggests that to understand the Marian nature of the illustration, one needs to look beyond their commentaries, into the broader exegetical, devotional, and theological traditions that surround Revelation 12 and its Marian uses. This 13th century illustration of the woman from the Douce Apocalypse mixes apocalyptic symbolism with the traditional iconographic signifiers used to represent Mary, such as the colors of her robe and the posing of her hands. Only a century later, though, this 14th century illustration of the woman from the Yates-Thompson 10 Codex is literally just a nativity if the oxen and cattle had been replaced with the hydra. Bergamini argues this is evidence of a slow cultural shift that artists were embracing even while theologians hemmed and hawed. The shift in question, of course, is towards a medieval cult of Mary. Devotion to Mary was prevalent in medieval culture, both in the ecclesiastical community and within the laity. The medieval church and its male theologians regarded the Virgin Mary as Queen of Heaven, full circle, but also the embodiment of the church and the intercessor of Christ. Medieval writers continued the dialogue of their predecessors regarding her elevated position within Catholic teaching and piety. By the 15th century, depictions of Mary like this one, currently held in the Met, were common. It was such a big deal that older statues of Mary were even retrofitted to include the sun, moon, and stars of the woman of the Apocalypse, such as this Mary within the chandelier in Bad Doberan, Germany, which was originally built in the 13th century, 200 years before the addition of the cosmic elements now seen. Removed now from the old zodiacal associations, the 12 stars became representative of the 12 apostles, the 12 tribes of Israel, or, according to this German pilgrimage prayer book by Michael Rohrmeyer that I literally translated, der Rosenkranz der 12 Sterne Maria, oder der 12 Privilegien, womit Maria vor allen anderen Menschen von Gott begnadigt werde. That is to say, the Rosary of the 12 Stars of Mary, which represent the 12 privileges with which Mary was pardoned above all other people. The hard part wasn't the translation, the hard part is figuring out what all those letters are supposed to be. Third, Reformation and Counter-Reformation. With the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, we split into two contrasting readings of the woman of the Apocalypse. During this time, the Catholic Church is digging in their heels and sticking to their guns, and it's in this time we see Baroque artists creating variations of Mary of the Apocalypse, like this painting by Diego Velázquez in 1618, and this painting by Giuseppe de Ribera in 1624. Meanwhile, however, the Protestant reformers were doing away with Marian devotion and the mysticism associated with medieval Catholic ritual and liturgy. Protestantism has always leaned towards being a more practical expression and practice of faith, for better or for worse. Martin Luther infamously disliked Revelation, saying once, "My spirit cannot fit itself into this book. There is one sufficient reason for me not to think highly of it. Christ is not taught or known in it." He did eventually get around to writing a brief commentary in what is now the 6th volume of his works. However, unsurprisingly, his analysis of the text reads as a very practical allegory for the history of the Church and a condemnation of the papacy. Luther's art buddy, Lucas Cranach the Elder, created this illustration of the woman Babylon, wearing a papal crown for Luther's 1522 New Testament. The only thing Luther has to say on the woman of the Apocalypse in his commentary is in the following quotation. In chapters 11 and 12, two comforting pictures are put between those evil woes and plagues. One, the picture of the two preachers, and the other of the pregnant woman who bears a man-child despite the dragon. They indicate that some pious teachers and Christians are to continue, under the first two woes and under the third, which is yet to come. Other reformers followed in Luther's footsteps, providing more detailed but no less practical readings. An English preacher in 1553 wrote a commentary on the Apocalypse titled, "The Ruin of Rome," or an exposition upon the whole revelation, wherein is plainly showed and proved that the popish religion, together with all the power and authority of Rome, shall ebb and decay still more and more throughout all the churches of Europe, and come to an utter overthrow even in this life before the end of the world. Written especially for the comfort of Protestants and the daunting of Papists, seminary priests, Jesuits, and all that cursed rabble. Published by Arthur Dent, preacher of the Word of God at South Shoebury in Essex. In this book, he says, I quote, "The church is here compared to a woman." And on the next page goes on to identify that the sun's clothed, to identify the sun she's clothed in as the sun of righteousness, and the moon under her feet as symbolic of all worldly mutable things upon which she treads, and finally, the 12 stars as the glory of the 12 apostles. Cut forward to the 1860s, and the trend continues with Joseph Smith's inspired translation of the Bible, where he straight up just says, the woman is the church. The dragon prevailed not against Michael, neither the child nor the woman, which was the kingdom of God, who had been delivered of her pains, and brought forth the kingdom of our God and his Christ. Finally, post-colonial Mexico. So far, this research has been largely Eurocentric. However, the age of exploration unsurprisingly led to unique blendings of exported Catholic doctrine with the customs and cultures of colonized peoples. Say that 3 times fast. The most famous of these is the Virgin of Guadalupe, patroness of Mexico, and likely the most famous modern image of the woman of the apocalypse. Notably, while in medieval Europe the crown of 12 stars were often the most emphasized element of woman as Mary's attire, the stars here have been moved to decoration on the lady's mantle. They're not even counted out. Much more significance has been given to the sun and moon imagery. She also has a slew of visuals that are unique to her, and I'll loop back to those in a minute. But to appreciate the significance of all these changes, it's necessary to recognize the patterns by which Christianity had been introduced to the native populations. Rosemary Radford Ruther describes how the Nahuas adopted the Spanish concept of saints and adapted it to their own understanding of local patron gods. Many traditional religious practices continued, now directed to the Christian God and saints. Given the population was already freely adapting Catholic ritual and doctrine for their setting, this is an ideal model for our question. How has the woman of the apocalypse been interpreted in different times and locations? Much scholarship has been done on the many ways her design directly reflects and speaks to Aztec cultural artifacts. Her green mantle is unique. Typically, Mary is robed in blues and reds from the Byzantine icon traditions. This green is likely reflective of the green quetzal tail feathers, worn as a sign of rank by Aztec nobility. In their paper, Westerveles and Singal further explain the floral designs that adorn Our Lady of Guadalupe's tunic are symbolic as well as decorative, in accordance with the conventions of Aztec glyphs, that is, standardized pictographic designs used by the Aztecs to convey symbolic meaning. They go on in their paper to exhaustively list each of the flowers depicted on her gown, what their significance in Aztec faith and life would have been, and what their specific placement on the Virgin's body likely denotes. For the sake of brevity, I won't go into it all, but I do want to focus on their note that the crescent moon she stands upon would have represented the Valley of Mexico, the Nahua's geographical, cultural, and spiritual center. According to the conventions of their code, the placement of Our Lady of Guadalupe upon this crescent moon symbolizes that she is rooted in and has arisen from their culture, geography, and spiritual traditions. Now, this is where Westerveles and Singal close their argument, with the chronicles of Aztec symbolism built into the design of Our Lady of Guadalupe. By ending the conversation there, they've neatly explained away her association to Revelation. So, to bring her back to her apocalyptic roots, we turn to David Sanchez's research. It has since been published in the aforementioned book, but I'm still waiting for mine to come in the mail, so my quotations come from his dissertation instead. Sanchez draws on the Leto Apollo combat myth analysis of the woman of the apocalypse from 1st century Asia Minor. He identifies the way that John of Patmos appropriated an imperial myth to create a narrative for the early church about resistance and hope. Sanchez argues that by associating Our Lady of Guadalupe with the woman of the apocalypse, a similar narrative was being formed for those living under the power of Spanish conquest, in the 16th, 17th century Americas. She was a direct appropriation of the Iberian form of the myth while simultaneously recreating or subverting it. Miguel Sanchez, an American-born Creole caught in the crosshairs of a long-running rivalry between peninsular Spaniards and American-born Creoles, located himself in an exegetical tradition of subverting the very myths used to justify one people's domination and control of the other. He is, to use a phraseology of Bill Ashcroft et al., writing back at the empire by subverting the empire's very own ideological apparatus. Miguel Sanchez, the first person to write down the Guadalupe myth, did so from the perspective of an American-born Spaniard Creole, but 6 months later, Luis Lasso de la Vega wrote his own version in Nahuatl, the native language, expanding the mythology beyond the Creole bubble. It's clear that whether the revolutionary concepts wrapped up in the myth of Guadalupe were fully realized at that time, her threat to the reigning orthodoxy was. Francisco de Bustamante preached in 1556, "Nothing is better calculated to keep the Indians from becoming good Christians than the cult of Our Lady of Guadalupe. To tell them now that an image painted by an Indian could work miracles will utterly confuse them and tear up the vine that has been planted." Though she has now been officially canonized, Our Lady of Guadalupe's subversive roots are necessary to understand her role as inheritor of the mantle of Revelation 12. So, to recap, we've looked at 4 periods of interpretation of the woman of the apocalypse. Of these periods, only the original author seems uninterested in providing a clear answer to the question of her identity and meaning. Generally, the interpretations have instead developed as reflections of cultural shifts and patterns. Medieval Christians saw her as distinctly Mary, despite scholarship that argued for more nuanced approaches in light of the cult of Mary. Protestant reformers saw her as a metaphor for the church, so much so that traditional Marian interpretations were fully castigated. Mexican Christians living under colonial rule saw her as a familiar native mediatrix in the face of foreign power, while the Catholic institution of the time saw her as a threat to cultural and religious orthodoxy. I want to take a minute to talk about images and control here. What emerges is a pattern of interpreting the woman of the apocalypse in light of that which she cannot be. The more stringently an individual or movement claims to know the woman's meaning, the more they become identified by that which they abhor. This can be subtle, like medieval illustrators ignoring the text they were illuminating in order to paint the woman the way they saw her. Or it can be blatant, like Arthur Dent writing a 94-word title to a book specifically insulting Catholics. This is the danger I want to identify. Only John of Patmos makes no effort to provide clarity in his vision, and we should follow his example. The point of the text is to seek for meaning. Once someone claims to own that meaning, however, to have authority over it, then they have fully lost the text. The more one claims to have exclusive ownership over truth in this matter and in all others, the more clearly their agendas show through their theology. I have to ask, how much did the Protestant reformers really care about the theological implications of the woman as a metaphor for the church, and how much did they just want to stick it to the Pope? Were their intentions to find God in the text, or to win their pissing contest with Rome? How much was Francisco de Bustamante truly concerned that the Lady of Guadalupe would lead converts astray, and how much of his concern had to do with the popularity of a Marian cult outside his order's control and influence? I need to be clear. There is nothing inherently wrong or bad with interpreting the woman of the apocalypse in light of one's current situation. That's literally the point. That is the purpose for which she was written. To quote myself 20 minutes ago, if John had wanted to make the woman in the apocalypse clearly the Virgin or the Church, he could have done so easily and with much less ambiguity. Her appearance is a model for how the promised kingdom of God will be a correction of the imperfect kingdoms of earth. Since the imperfect kingdoms of earth make themselves known in ever new and more inventive ways, for the woman to retain value to new readers, she must be applicable to ever stranger futures. To interpret the woman in light of your circumstances is to follow in the footsteps of the 7 churches to whom John of Patmos wrote. However, politics and agendas are always easier to see in hindsight. Much more likely is that the examples I listed before, Bustamante and the Protestant reformers, would see no distinction between their political agendas and the work of God on earth, and so is likely the case for us as well. The value of research such as this, then, is to provide a model for how to recognize the patterns of how culture and agendas influence interpretation, and to give us tools to recognize it in our own time. Not because the influences are bad, but because understanding where those influences come from keep us from conflating them with the true purpose, the text, God. It's been 25 minutes. Thanks for sticking with me. Have a bibliography.